What do you think of when you hear the word Islam? Maybe you think of grand old mosques dotted round the Middle East. Or maybe you think straight away of the recent terrorist attacks in Europe or in the USA. Or perhaps you think of your peaceful neighbour or your friend from work. But do you think of the diversity in Islam? Do you think of the different denominations, the great divide between the Sunni and the Shia? Do you only think of Arab Muslims? What about Muslims outside the Middle East? Do you think that Islam presents a challenge to Christianity? But what kind of challenge? It can be so easy for us in the UK to isolate Islam into only being about these few things that we hear about. But the reality is, Muslims make up around 23% of the world's population. That's a massive 1.6 billion people. Surely there's more to Islam than these few facts that we've seen on the news or learnt at school. Islam began in the 7th century, started by a man called Muhammad. And since its early days in Medina and Mecca, it has spread around the globe rapidly. But maybe not quite to the places you expected. Here is a list of the top 10 countries organised by Muslim population. The country with the largest population of Muslims is actually Indonesia. But we don't usually associate Islam with East Asia. In fact, only one of the top 10 countries by Muslim population is actually in the Middle East. Surprising? That means that around 62% of Muslims globally live in the Asia-Pacific area. Well, what does this 62% look like? Are they one homogeneous group, or are they more diverse? Well, they consist of 11 nations and at least 300 different people groups. Not only that, but some of the nations are also run by Islamic governments, whilst in other nations the Muslim population is a persecuted minority. The differences and the diversity are huge. So what does this mean for us? What are the specific challenges for Christians? Islamization means the growth of political Islam. It's a general term that we use to describe a desire of Islamists to establish an Islamic state or caliphate under Sharia law. The failure of westernization has led to a rising trend towards Islamization in the Islamic world. Muslims are returning to the traditions, returning to the teachings of the first 3 generations of leaders who succeeded Muhammad. Islamization reinforces the concept that Islam is the final religion, the culmination of all others, and reinforces the superiority and finality of Muhammad and his revelation, the Quran. It's an attractive, orthodox, scriptural reformist movement that's spreading throughout the Muslim world. Names familiar to us like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda and IS are all Islamist movements. But there are others that are spreading around the world. The Muslim Brotherhood coming out of Egypt, Tablighi Jamaat and Hizb ut-Tahrir, to name a few. However, some groups reject the teaching towards a violent jihad, while there are others who are happy to use political influence to achieve the goal of an Islamic state. A strong, assertive Islam results in a stronger Muslim identity, and many would see those with a strong Muslim identity as being more resistant to the gospel. In countries where Islamism is dominant, there's also a real threat to Christians. Islamists affirm the Islamic teaching that apostasy is punishable by death, and there's always the threat of violence towards Muslims who show interest in Christianity in these countries. One of the results of this growing Islamization is that it creates fear which hinders indigenous mission. fear paralyzes indigenous Christianity and therefore also paralyzes the growth of indigenous mission. In the West, we've experienced this fear ourselves, but it's not confined to the West. Our picture of Islam is tainted by these violent sects of Islamism. We see the countless examples of violence and destruction perpetrated by groups like ISIS, and it can shackle us. But this is not just the case in the West. This fear extends to the church globally and restricts mission to Muslims. We need more indigenous missionaries, people who want to reach out to Muslims in their own country. There are exceptions to this paralysis though. Across India and parts of China and even in Indonesia, there are groups of Christians today intentionally reaching out to the Muslims around them. Even though Islamism and these traditional forms of Islam are growing, there are still very many cultural Muslims who are very open to getting to know their Christian friends. Muslims need to know Jesus, so Christians must overcome their fears in order to reach them. For many Muslims, their social and ethnic identity is so bound up in their religious identity. It's so much like this that to change religion would be to betray your culture and your ancestors. It would be like us having to cease to be British in order to become a Christian, which is almost unintelligible to us. Mixing this cultural Islamic identity with living in a communal culture like Indonesia, as opposed to our individualistic culture, then you end up with an extremely tough environment for mission, where changing religion is seen as denying your ethnicity, betraying your society, and deserting your family. We need to help believers in the Lord Jesus explore what it means to be a Christian in an Islamic culture. What is an appropriate cultural expression of Christianity? How do we help a Sundanese in Indonesia establish a Christian Sunda identity? Or a Hui believer in China to have a Christian Hui identity? We need great wisdom. We need to pray. Change can happen even though we face challenges. God can and does and is calling people to himself. But we need to get involved. There are so many ways that you can get involved in reaching out to Muslims. But here are 3 great ideas to get you started. Learn, pray, go. You can read, you can pray, or you can go.